You might see the term blended whiskey on a whiskey label, like this Johnny Walker Green label. But what does that mean? And how does the definition change in different countries? In today's Heart Cut, we'll dive into the definition of blended whiskey and prepare you to make the best choices when you see that on the label. So why is blended whiskey so popular? Think about it this way. The best artists take elements of what others have done and improve upon it by adding their own flair and style. Similarly, the best blenders can take what distilleries have created and join them together to create a whiskey that's greater than the sum of its parts. Before we go any further, thank you for watching this video. And while you're reaching for your next dram, why don't you take a detour and hit those like and subscribe buttons. Those poor buttons can't taste whiskey like we do, so show them some love. Plus, if you like this content a lot, check out the Heart Cut newsletter, which has a whole bunch of goodies that aren't on YouTube. Check it out, the link's in the description below. Now, back to the video. So, just what is blended whiskey? While the legal definition changes based on where you live, in general, blended whiskey is whiskey made by blending two other types of whiskeys or spirits. The exact definition depends on what kind of whiskey you're looking at. So, we're going to go one by one through all the major types of whiskey and describe what blended whiskey means. Let's start with Scotch. Now in Scotland, there are 5 legal categories of whiskey: single malt, single grain, blended malt, blended grain, and blended whiskey. Single malt is made of 100% malted barley and consists of whiskey distilled and aged by a single distillery. Single grain is whiskey made from grains other than malted barley, though most of the time some malted barley is included, and it comes from a single distillery. Now the blended categories are then combinations of those basic building blocks. Blended malt, which Johnny Walker Green label is a blended malt, it's a blend of only single malts. Blended grain is a blend of only single grains. And blended whiskey is a blend of both single malts and single grains. Blended whiskey is the most common category and still makes up about 90% of Scotch whiskey sales. Johnny Walker, Dewar's, and Compass Box are examples of blended Scotch whiskey. The grain whiskeys are typically made using column stills and have a much lighter flavor. Therefore, the more grain whiskey present in a blend, the lighter the resulting blend, and often, it's cheaper too. Blended malts, such as Johnny Walker Green label, tend to have more robust flavors to them. Now, all whiskey that goes into a Scotch blend must be aged in oak casks for at least 3 years. So you know that all the whiskey you're getting in a blended Scotch is actually whiskey. Unfortunately, the same can't be said in America. So blended whiskey isn't as common in the States, but it does exist. However, there is a major difference between blended American whiskey and blended Scotch. In America, it's permitted to add neutral grain spirit, which is essentially vodka, to the whiskey. That means that many of the bargain blended American whiskeys that you may find on the bottom shelf are actually mostly flavorless neutral grain spirit with a little aged whiskey added in. Here at the Heart Cut, we're not here for brown vodka, so be careful and pay attention to what you buy. Does that mean that all blended whiskey in America is no good? Not at all. An example is Few Spirits Blended American Whiskey. That's F-E-W, Few. They have a blended American whiskey that blends their bourbon, rye, and single malt whiskeys together. Also, Bluebird Distillery here in Pennsylvania, they have one called Phoenixville Whiskey, which is a blend of bourbon, rye, and wheat whiskeys. These are legitimate blends of aged whiskeys built to create unique flavor experiences. So the moral of the story is just read up on the whiskey you're considering and make sure it is what you think it is. Okay, up next, Canadian whiskey. Now, virtually all Canadian whiskey is blended, even though there are a couple of distilleries popping up that are making single malts. However, it's blended in a slightly different way than in other countries. Canadian whiskey is made up of two components, a light whiskey and a flavor whiskey. These two whiskeys are mashed, fermented, distilled, and aged separately, and then blended once they've matured. Now, how is that different? Well, if we take an American whiskey as an example, maybe a high rye bourbon that has a mash bill. Now, the mash bill is 60% corn, let's say, 25% rye, and 15% malted barley. Now, in America, you would mash, ferment, and distill all those grains together, and then age the resulting spirit as one spirit. In Canada, each of those grains would be turned into whiskey and aged separately in different casks, and then blended after aging. It seems like a subtle difference, but it does make a difference in flavor. Now, before we move on from Canadian whiskey, I want to address the 9.09 rule. You may have heard it, but in case you haven't, it refers to the law that allows 9.09% of a Canadian blended whiskey to contain another flavoring spirit. Now, in the 1980s and 90s, this usually meant some kind of citrus wine. And this practice was largely adopted by bargain basement brands wanting to take advantage of tax savings offered by the United States if they used an American-sourced spirit in that 9.09%. This has given Canadian whiskey a bit of a bad reputation. However, for the record, I want to say that the vast majority of Canadian whiskeys only contain whiskey. However, it's good to remain vigilant, so just stick to the vetted whiskey brands that you know are high quality. Okay, on to Irish. When it comes to blends, Irish whiskey is similar to Scotch, so I won't spend a whole lot of time on it, but there are three major categories of Irish whiskey. Grain whiskey is made from a mixture of grains, malt whiskey made from 100% malted barley, and then pot still whiskey, which is Ireland's unique style of whiskey. And that's made from a mixture of malted and unmalted barley plus other grains, distilled typically 3 times, and made in a pot still. And blended whiskey is simply a blend of 2 or 3 of these categories. Very simple. So we'll round out our tour with Japan. Japanese whiskey is a can of worms because Japanese regulations aren't as well defined as in other countries. This means that sometimes the definition of a Japanese whiskey blend is kind of whatever the blender says it is. For example, some Japanese whiskeys will import Scotch and mix it with real Japanese whiskey made in Japan, and then slap a label on it that says it's Japanese whiskey. The problem with this is that not every brand is transparent about what's in the bottle. So be careful with what you buy. Here at the Heart Cut, we're all about transparency, and as long as the distillery is open with what they do, it's not that huge of a problem. You have a choice whether you want to accept it or reject it. The problem is when they don't tell you, and then you're drinking something that you think is Japanese whiskey, but it's really just Scotch. So while we wait for a stricter, more defined definition of Japanese whiskey, stick to the well-known quality brands such as Suntory or Hibiki. These are really good, high-quality Japanese whiskeys. Carefully read the label before you buy anything to make sure you know what you're getting. So there you have it. Now you know what blended whiskey is. Now, some whiskey enthusiasts will balk at blended whiskey, but is that really how we should view it? While I definitely prefer single malts for their distinctive flavors, I've learned to appreciate the art of blending. As with all whiskey, it's the love and the care that you put into the blend that matters. In fact, even single malts are blended. They just come from a single distillery, but there's still multiple casks blended together to create that consistent profile of that single malt. Yes, many blends may be boring to single malt lovers, but those same single malt lovers, myself included, likely started their whiskey journey with blended whiskey, and so did I. Johnny Walker was my first Scotch. So whether they want to admit it or not, a lot of times blended whiskey is how people enter the whiskey scene. Also, many blenders, like Compass Box as an example, and Monkey Shoulder, they're truly trying to create interesting and fantastic blends that have integrity behind them. And let's be honest, historically speaking, single malt whiskey wouldn't even be a category if blended whiskey didn't come first and make whiskey popular, especially in the case of Scotch. So even if blended whiskey isn't your preference, show it the respect it deserves. Thanks for tuning in to this episode of The Heart Cut, and I'll see you next time.